My name is Alexandra Wells. I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for the network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Jörg Broschek, who is the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Federalism and Multilevel Governance, and an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. Welcome, Professor Broschek, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandra, and thanks for the invitation.
So in our interview today, we want to focus on the involvement of regional actors in European Union trade policy. To begin, could you explain who those regional actors are and how they may be involved in EU trade policy?
Yeah, so the broader context for my research that I've been doing over the last couple of years, also in collaboration with other colleagues, has been primarily on federalism. So we originally have focused on the question why and to what extent and how do sub-federal units engage in trade policy. And for this specific paper that I co-authored with Christian Freudelsberger, we focused, actually we broadened the horizon in one respect, because we also included regional actors. So that means not like the provinces, a constitutionalized sub-federal entity, but also regional units in unitary states, for example, like the Italian regions or the French regions or the Spain region, autonomous communities. So it's both federal entities as well as regional units in unitary states.
And as you've noted, there is considerable variety in the extent of the involvement of regional actors, and your research tries to explain what drives their involvement, and you highlight three causal factors: institutions, identities, and interests. Can you explain these three factors?
The first consideration that informs our research is that in order to participate in trade policy, we need to understand that, for the most part at least, regional units as well as federal entities in federal states do not have direct constitutional competencies that would allow them to participate in trade policy. Trade policy, at least formally defined, is usually a prerogative of traditionally the federal level exclusively, or in the European Union, now a shared jurisdiction between the supranational level as well as the federal level in federal states or the central level in unitary states. So the question is, what instruments do regional or federal units have in order to participate or being able to participate in the first place? So we look at these specific resources, which are often more indirect resources. For example, if a trade agreement has an implication or an effect for exclusive jurisdictions of a federal entity, then this could prompt sub-federal participation, for example. So that's one. The second sort of motive or interest or motivation for participating would be regional economic. So of course, these regional units or federated units do have economic policies in place, and they want to sort of utilize trade policy in order to either protect their regional economic situation or economies, or to promote them. So that would be a second one. And then a third category could be political or identity-based. That has received more attention more recently, since we've been observing, at least in some cases, an increased engagement, which is often linked to contestation, Europeanization, etc., politicization. And that directs our attention to more general, again, political motivations behind sub-federal or regional trade policy engagement. That means governments intend to, for example, promote environmental policies through that. They maybe are concerned about human rights violations, if we think about trade agreements in other regions, or they are really concerned with the implications that trade agreements have for their own institutional autonomy or their capacities. If we think about procurement, for example, or service sector liberalization, that has potentially important implications for cantons. If we think about Switzerland now, or let's say the Länder in Germany, or the municipalities, which are also often an important part of the sub-federal level.
And our Jean Monnet Network is particularly interested in the politicization and public contestation of trade agreements. So how would you describe the relationship between public contestation, the response of regional units, and the subsequent crystallization of regional involvement in EU trade affairs?
There is no doubt that contestation and politicization has an impact on also the regional mobilization in trade politics. We can see this in Europe, or many European countries in particular, between 2014 and 16 or 17. We saw these mass demonstrations in cities like Berlin, Vienna, and other cities as well, against recent trade agreement, which received a lot of media attention, like TTIP, first of all, and then CETA and others as well. So there is, of course, there's a reason, or that may be one reason for why certain governments, sub-federal governments or regional governments, may become engaged. However, what we also found in our research is that this is certainly not the only reason. First of all, if you step back and take a more sort of take a look at the moving picture rather than the snapshot view, we see that the German Länder, for example, have been participating in trade-related fields for quite some time. You can trace this back to the early 90s, in some instances even the late 80s, in the context of the creation of the common market, for example, where there was quite some engagement. And that was long before we saw this more recent contestation. So that is one thing. The other thing is that it's often not as clear-cut to what extent federal or sub-federal or regional engagement is a direct response to politicization. And there's one very instructive example from Germany, and that was the ratification of a trade agreement with Central American states in 2013. So in that specific instance, the Länder became quite engaged, and they ratified the agreement, but they passed a accompanying resolution to that where they indicated and flagged a number of concerns, quite detailed, by the way. And that was before TTIP, shortly before, but it was still before TTIP really entered sort of the political radar and became a larger issue. And that lets us to conclude that while contestation is important, certainly, we may understand it perhaps rather as a catalyst, rather than a cause in the first place. That doesn't diminish, again, the political dimension of this. There have always been political motives behind engagement, but I would be careful to conclude that recent sub-federal or regional engagement is a direct response primarily to contestation.
And do you find that one of the three factors that you mentioned, institutions, identity, and interests, is more influential than the others in explaining when regional actors have the ability to exert influence in different stages of the trade policy cycle?
This question requires more research, and that's what we're doing at the moment, especially this paper that was part of the workshop. We're currently revising it to prepare the second draft. We'll focus exactly more in depth on this question. Again, it is not that easy, and it also depends a lot on where you look and when you look. For some sub-federal units, for example, economic motives may be the prime motivation behind their engagement. For others, it may be more political. So one thing that we need to pay closer attention here is, for example, the party the partisan composition of sub-federal governments. So if you have, for example, a coalition government that entails more center-left or left-leaning parties, it may become more reasonable to suggest that political motives and institutional concerns about autonomy may be more important than regional economic interests or preferences. And this, again, is very interesting if you compare it also with federations outside of Europe, which something I did with also with a colleague of mine here, where we compared the Canadian provinces, for example, with the German, Swiss, and Austrian Länder and cantons, where you can see that for the Canadian provinces, economic preferences are, I would say, even the most important, if not almost the only primary driver of their engagement, and they are engaging quite thoroughly and strongly, at least in important trade agreements. Whereas for the European side, we see that political motives seem to carry more causal weight here, and especially also if you think about Belgium, the Walloon example, which is a very prominent and well-known case here. That is an expression of primarily political motives here.
And that brings us to our final question. So in future, do you think that regional involvement in EU multi-level trade governance will play a more important role in EU trade affairs, particularly given the deepening of trade policy in recent years?
I would say yes. Again, first of all, what I find always very interesting is stepping back, taking a more historical approach to these questions. And you see that this has been actually an ongoing development for quite some time. However, it is not ongoing in the sense that the European sub-federal entities or regional entities have developed, let's say, trade ministries or institutional resources that would allow them to really focus on these issues with institutional resources on an ongoing basis. It is interesting to see that if I take, for example, the German case, that there are specific intergovernmental bodies among the Länder that focus on these questions when they become more salient. For example, the intergovernmental body that looks at economic policies has been very active in on this files, or the Council of Ministers for European Affairs has been very active. The same holds for environmental ministers or ministers for consumer protection. So that is something that is interesting, especially again if we compare it with the Canadian case, where we can see that many provinces really have established trade ministries and a bureaucracy behind that. So the participation is there. It will, in my view, there are many conditions or factors that support the assumption that they are here to stay. This is an ongoing thing, but it is not an institutional development that is deeply institutionalized or sort of that would show this persistence. However, again, as you said earlier, given the importance of trade agreements ongoing, also the contestation, which is still there, although we don't see at the moment that many people on the streets opposing specific trade agreements, will certainly keep this topic on the agenda of sub-federal and regional units. And I think these units are now, they have become a more structural part of trade governance in the European Union, why it is reasonable to say it's a multi-level trade governance configuration that we're seeing.
Well, that concludes our interview today. And thank you again, Professor Broschek, for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.